What up, though? This is your boy Mike D, host of Wrestling from the 313, and we are live right now on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. And as always, this episode is brought to you by WSN, the Wrestling Society Network. Make sure you check them out on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire Stick. Download the app, check out all the cool wrestling content, documentaries, wrestling shows, cartoons. They got it all. So make sure you check them out, and shout out to the WSN family. So my guest today is a Michigan native like myself. He's an author, and right now he has a book, which I have in my hand right now. It's A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling History from 1880 to 1950. And we are going to talk a lot about this book. Ian Douglas, as we like to say here in Detroit, what up, though? Welcome to Wrestling from the 313.
What up, though? Indeed, as we were talking off air, I'm a Southfield native, so the slang is about the same. I've been hearing that my whole life.
That's what's up. So real quick before we talk about the book, let's just talk about how you just got started being a fan of pro wrestling.
That one's easy. Giving my age away a little bit here, but that's okay. I don't mind owning it and being the old man that I am. 1986, Macho Man Randy Savage. I was 6 years old. First time I accidentally turned on the WWF, looking for Saturday morning cartoons. Saw Randy Savage drop a double X handle to somebody's neck from the top rope out to the floor, then roll him into the ring and drop the elbow from the top rope to his chest. I was hooked from that moment on. That's how I became a wrestling fan. It was that simple. It was Randy Savage, 100%.
Hey, you know what? We're around the same age because that's when I started watching wrestling too. I was probably between the age of, I want to say between the age of 3 and 5, between like 84, 86, something like that. And
okay.
I've been hooked on it since then. You know what I'm saying? And I love the way how it's evolved now from how it is now. Who would ever thought that pro wrestling would be this big? You know, like WrestleMania is almost as big as the Super Bowl and the national championship in college football. So, you know, it's definitely like I said, I'm a big fan and always been a big fan, and I'm gonna continue as long as the product is good. And this is not just WWF, but AEW, TNA, you know, and even the independents, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, wrestling is like rap music, in my opinion. It's all over the place, you know what I'm saying? And I just love it. I'm always gonna be a fan.
Well, when we started watching, you couldn't have told me that wrestling wasn't as big as the NFL or any of the major sports leagues. When they're putting 93,000, even though Meltzer will tell you it was a smaller paid figure, but when they're putting 93,000 fans in the Pontiac Silverdome, and then a few years later, they're selling out the Sky Dome, and then they're selling out the Hoosier Dome. You couldn't have told me that wrestling wasn't every bit as big as the NFL back then.
Definitely. So let's talk about the book, A Decided Novelty. What inspired you to start researching and writing A Decided Novelty? And was there a specific moment that made you realize this history needed to be told?
Oh, goodness gracious. This question. Okay. So for me, a Decided Novelty was book number 9.
Okay.
And 2 things happened that led to its creation. So the Pro Wrestling Authors Hall of Fame was created, and what they really did was just induct the wrestling authors who had 4 or more books of a certain length and certain type into the Hall of Fame. And so it wound up being 30 people. I was the only black one. And so when I looked at the screen and you see all those images, and I felt a certain sense of responsibility that came with that, because I'd already had some people who are friends of mine in the wrestling writing space saying things to me like, hey, congratulations, you're the best Black pro wrestling author of all time. And I write for Men's Health magazine and got to cover wrestling for them. And I write presently for The Ringer and got to cover wrestling for them. And when I was the sports editor, or not sports editor, the fitness editor for Mel magazine, they gave me a certain amount of leeway. And so I was able to interview Dave Meltzer for Mel magazine about the 40th anniversary of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. So I got to do all of these things. And so I'm thinking, okay, if people think I'm the best Black pro wrestling author, like if that's a true thing, then do I have any responsibilities here? Because at the time of that induction, my books were Dan Severn's autobiography, Hornswoggle's autobiography, Bugsy McGraw's autobiography, Killer B. Brian Blair's autobiography, 2 books from Steve Kern, and then the history of pro wrestling in the Bahamas, which is my mom's native country. So we've got those 7. Like, do I have a responsibility? Now, people will argue that the Bahamas Wrestling History book is a Black pro wrestling history book, and to a degree it is. But beyond that, do I have a certain amount of responsibility? You know, if someone else was the top Black pro wrestling author, would I look at their output and say, you know what, if they're supposed to be the standard bearer for that, what would I want to see from them? And so when I saw that, I looked at the landscape and said, okay, what's missing? Where is there a need? And how can I fulfill that need? Now, that also happened roughly around the same time where I pitched an idea to The Ringer that to Dave Shoemaker at The Ringer, who's technically my boss there, that there really wasn't a lot of coverage of pre-1950s Black wrestlers. So whenever a profile was done on somebody like Reginald Siki or some other folks, they were just guessing with respect to who was the first person to do something. They really didn't know. And I'd done a little bit of research on guys like Jack Claiborne and Rufus Jones, the original Rufus Jones. And I saw some of the incredible things they were doing in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, but I couldn't definitively say one of them was the first to do something if I didn't know what preceded them or what was happening concomitant to what they were doing. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go back to 1880. Like as far back as really I can establish when the first guy popped up sort of in the American mainstream, who was Vero Small. And I'm going to make a list of every guy who was significant, like stuck around for more than a month. And I'm going to do a profile on them. I sort of decided like the major figures I knew, Jack Claiborne, Celie Samara, Rufus Jones, Black Panther Jim Mitchell, Alex Kaffner, the Black Panther of really Wisconsin, and Lee Umbles, a few other guys. Those guys I got to cap at like 10,000 to 15,000 words. The rest, I'm going to try to get 2,000 to 5,000 out of them. And then I need to figure out how to arrange it all chronologically so that, because you can take the easy way out in something like this. You could say, here's the Alex Kaffner profile. Here's the Celie Samara profile, and you can just hop around. But I decided to blend it all together chronologically so that you knew when Celie Samara and Jack Claiborne are in Australia in 1947, you know that Jim Mitchell is back in Massachusetts wearing a mask, being booked as an East Indian wrestler and headbutting everybody in sight. And when he takes the mask off, and it's exposed that he's a Black wrestler, he continues headbutting everybody in sight. And that's when he became this like full-fledged practitioner of headbutt usage. years after guys like the original Rufus Jones, mind you. So that's the sort of process that went into making this book.
That's what's up. Now to go back, you said you wrote a book, the pro wrestling history of the Bahamas. That's interesting, right there.
This guy right here. I can't see through the blurring a little bit, but Bahamian Rhapsody, the unofficial history of pro wrestling's unofficial territory.
Okay, sweet. Talk a little bit about the book, the pro wrestling history in the Bahamas.
Absolutely. The first pro wrestling event I ever saw live, because I could never get my dad to take me to one. The first pro wrestling event I ever saw live, my uncles knew. I think the only thing they knew about me when I was 9 years old was that I was an avid pro wrestling fan. And so we got off the plane at the airport, and they drove me out east. We got to my Uncle David's house, and he said, "I'm going to take you to see wrestling." I didn't know that pro wrestling existed outside of the WWF bubble. I didn't know a single thing about a territorial system. I barely knew anything about the NWA or World Championship Wrestling at that time. And he said, "I'm going to take you to see Dusty Rhodes." I had no idea who Dusty Rhodes was in 1989. And he takes me to what he tells me is Nassau Stadium, which was really really it started off as a place for them to stash their taxi cabs. And it was really just a courtyard. It had been used as a skating rink at different times, or an indoor skating rink at different times. You could play basketball in there. And it was a restaurant, but on Fridays and Saturdays, it could be used for boxing. It was owned by a guy named Charlie Major, who was on the boxing commission of the Bahamas. And it was also used for professional wrestling events on Saturdays. And so we walked in one door, you immediately walked out another into the courtyard. And you're staring right at you're staring directly at a wrestling ring set up in the middle of the courtyard. You take your seat. There was mesh wire set up over the entrance, and I saw all this debris on top of it, and I'm like, "What's that?" It had been put up to catch all of the bottles and everything else that was being hurled at the wrestlers as they made their way out to the ring. Wow. So while I was there, I got to see Scotty Flamingo, who was Scott Levy, Raven. This is 1989. Yeah. I got to see Mike Graham, Eddie Graham's son. I got to see Steve Kern. I got to see the Nasty Boys wrestling against Johnny Ace, better known as John Laurinaitis, and his brother, the Terminator. And in the main event, I got to see a Texas death match, which featured Dusty Rhodes against Big Steel Man, real name Fred Ottman, who wrestled in the WWF as Tugboat and as Typhoon. Yeah. And had we not visited the Bahamas that month, I never would have gotten a chance to see Dusty Rhodes wrestle live, because 2 weeks later he left and went to the WWF and started wrestling in polka dots. But from that moment, because obviously that blows your mind when your only concept of wrestling is WWF action that takes place in major arenas. So from that point on, I wanted to know everything about what I'd just seen. And so that started a bit of an obsession with wrestling in the Bahamas. And that was another case where, like, even when I started writing about wrestling and with wrestlers, that was sort of like the personal holy grail of projects. Like, this is the book that I want to see written, and I don't think anyone else is going to write it, so I have to figure out a way to do it myself. And I wound up getting in touch with researchers at the University of Florida, paid them to pull the archives of the Nassau Guardian and the Nassau Tribune to get as much research as we could. And then I interviewed 40 different people for the book. So everyone from Dory Funk Jr. to Steve Kern to Mike Rotunda to Tyree Pride to Kevin Sullivan. Everybody I could get a hold of who was still alive and willing and able to talk, who had something to do with pro wrestling in the Bahamas.
That's what's up. And I noticed you said like when you were younger, the only thing you really knew about was like WWF. You wasn't really exposed to like NWA.
Yeah.
And I agree with what you said, because like when we were younger around that time, NWA/WCW wasn't really on like regular TV. That was like during the daytime, it was always WWF. If NWA and WCW came on, it was always at like 1, 2 in the morning on like Saturday nights or something, like late Saturday night or whatever. But that was around the time that like I think I got exposed to WCW maybe like early 90s, 91, 92, something like that. I think that's when my parents at first got cable.
Same.
Hey, because everything used to come on all their shows came on TBS. That's when everything was 605, 635. But yeah, once I had got exposed to WCW, that's when I started realizing, I'm like, okay, so this guy that left WWF, this is where he went. And the guys that was in WCW, they like, oh, he wrestled here and he in WWF now. So that was definitely like a cool time around that time to get kind of exposed to WCW, because that's all people knew when you was growing up watching wrestling, especially in Detroit. That's all you knew was WWF.
Yeah, because our territory run by the Sheik, it died in 1980. So yeah. we grew up. If your upbringing was at all like mine, my dad certainly didn't watch wrestling, but he knew the names Bobo Brazil and Dick the Bruiser, and so you had a certain generation of wrestling fan, or even if they weren't a wrestling fan, they would repeat those names, and I had no clue what they were talking about, because we didn't have the wrestling territory. So WWF was the only game in town for the most part on syndicated television.
Yeah. My dad was, I think he was a wrestling fan because I was a fan. He like would watch it and, kind of keep up with it a little bit. But I remember going to the shows, Cobo Hall, Joe Louis Arena, 2 historic arenas that I wish were still up, especially Joe Louis. But I just remember going to those house shows, seeing The Undertaker when he first debuted, and even up to now, me and my wife, we go to wrestling shows. We've been to shows at Joe Louis, Little Caesars Arena. We went to SummerSlam. We went to some NXT house shows and stuff. So, like I said, it's been fun just being a wrestling fan, man.
Yeah, the last show I've been to, it's been a while. The last show I went to was a Deadlock Pro Wrestling indie show here in Durham, North Carolina, where they had a decent amount of TNA and AEW talent working on the show, and I was covering the event for The Ringer. And a few years before that, there was a New Japan Pro Wrestling show at the Armory in Durham with Hiroshi Tanahashi in a 6-man tag. The Rock and Roll Express was there for some reason. That was weird. Frankly, like seeing them in the set was just like a culture clash, seeing them in the ring with all of the modern New Japan guys. But yeah, that was fun. But it's been a while for me. It's certainly a while. So the last wrestling show, the last wrestling event I went to in Detroit was WrestleMania 23.
Okay. Oh yeah, Ford Field. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the I know people don't really want to hear this, but that was the hair versus hair match, Trump and Vince McMahon.
That's right.
I wish I would have went, but I definitely got a chance to go to SummerSlam a couple years back, and it was amazing energy. It was a sellout crowd, good show, and they need to bring more shows back to Detroit. I definitely hope that they do that in the near future.
Yeah, there's nothing like the feeling of a wrestling event when the crowd is fully engaged.
Oh yeah.
And but I mean, thankfully, even the Deadlock Pro Wrestling show here, I don't know if there were more than, and it was at like a hotel ballroom, and I don't know if there were more than 200 fans. I don't know if there were more than 200 fans in the hall, and it was the one of the livest events I've ever been to, because everybody was just fully locked in and enjoying themselves and involved in every second of the matches. And the wrestlers there, like they did not shortchange the fans. They gave them everything they had. It was fantastic.
That's what's up. So how far did you go? How did you go about uncovering stories from far back as the 1880s? And what were some of your biggest challenges in your research?
Oh goodness. Okay. I mean, how did I go about it? The long and short of the answer is straight to newspapers.com.
Okay.
Insert the right sets of bracketed keywords, and then just find and see what extends out to the point where it becomes relevant. And that's why it's a book that took 2 years to write. And all of these things take years to write if you're doing them well. And you're not going to write. You're not going to write. I mean, even if you're writing something completely off the top of your head, once you think you're doing a project that's 400, 500, or in this case, close to 600 pages long, you're simply not going to do it on a single burst of energy that's a week long. Like, you have to set miniature goals. Like, this month is Jack Claiborne month. On this day, I have these 2 hours, and I'm going to go through every newspaper clipping of his from 1946, see which clippings are relevant to his story, log those away. I might do that for 2 weeks, and then for the next 2 weeks, I go back to every single relevant link that I found, and I write up a summary of that. Okay. And that becomes the project for that month. And if it was successful, I file it away. And the more of those that you string together, suddenly you just develop enough momentum that it becomes impossible not to write the book. And I mean, that's how it happens. You just have to grind. One day after another. I've got an hour of free time, and that's what I'm devoting the hour to. And as far as the biggest challenges go, frankly, it was with piecing certain things together, because you've got if you're thorough and you take your time, it increases the likelihood that you're going to get lucky in your research. And by that, I mean, I'd more or less put a timetable together of events like that. You've got Vero Small in the 1880s, 1890s. And then you've got a few guys who made attempts that didn't really pan out. And you've got Frank Crozier off in England, the Scottish Jamaican who wins the Alhambra London World Middleweight Wrestling Tournament.
Okay.
And becomes the world middleweight champion for a year. That's in 1905, 1906. And then back stateside, you've got a European wrestler named Illa Kuba Vincent, who was likely of African descent from one of the German colonies, who comes over speaking fluent German. And the Chicago press has absolutely no idea what to do with this guy. And the promoter, it seems like the promoter rebranded him as a Cuban because they figured that he would be more relatable, because he's obviously a foreigner, if they say he's Cuban. Although in all likelihood, he was an African native from a German colony. So and then you get to him, and then from him it's a short jump to Reginald Seekey, And I know what happens from there. But in the midst of doing this, I discover that you have a few newspaper writers who are comparing Illa Vincent to a guy named Clarence Bolden. And they're saying, well, Vincent is Cuban and he's like Clarence Bolden, who's also Cuban. So I'm like, that's interesting. Let me look up Clarence Bolden. And I look up Bolden and I find a couple, I think it's literally 2 newspaper articles where he's a post-career article where he's being described as black, like he's as Negro. He was a Negro. And then there's another one from like when he's actually becoming a hot commodity, and they refer to him as a full-blooded Negro. So I look up his photo, and nobody would confuse him with being a full-blooded Negro. I'm half white. He's lighter than me. So then I'm like, okay, that's interesting, but why would people have thought that then? And then I go and look up, I do a much broader search from well before his wrestling career. And I find some very interesting articles about 2 brothers named Clarence Bolden and Harvey Bolden in Kansas City who were getting arrested for theft. And the paper is describing them as Negroes who are so light-skinned that they're mistaken for white, which leads to instances of mistaken identity. I'm like, okay, are these our guys? So then I go to Ancestry.com and I start pulling census records from Kansas City and marriage records. And I find you got Clarence Bolden, who lied about his age because legally the man had to be 21 and the woman had to be 17 in order to get a marriage license in Kansas City at the time. And it was illegal an interracial marriage was illegal there at the time. So we know for a fact in order to get legally married, they had to be considered to be the same race. And then you go to the census records and it says Clarence Bolden, Negro, living with his wife, Negro, and his mother-in-law and brother-in-law, both Negro, in an all-black neighborhood. It's like, okay, that's pretty cut and dried. And then by the latter half of 1900, he's waiting tables in Cleveland, Ohio. His wife is nowhere to be seen. And 4 years later, he's being hailed as one of the top young wrestling prospects that has ever come through Cleveland. 2 years after that, he's winning the World Middleweight Championship. The year after that, he beats Frank Gotch in a real wrestling match when Gotch is the world heavyweight champion and outweighs him by 30 pounds. Now, I need to be careful. He won a match against Gotch on technicality. And then Gotch beats him in a 2 out of 3 falls match where Bolden takes the first fall very early. And Gotch has to come back and win. And then Gotch says to the press, because he was very cocky before the match, Gotch says to the press, I outweigh this guy by 30 pounds. I barely beat him. If he was 30 pounds heavier, he would be the world heavyweight champion today. So when you zoom out and you view this in its historical context, this is Frank Gotch, considered the best pro wrestler of the era, saying that a guy who was legally black who would have legally been considered black at the time, who is the world middleweight champion and world light heavyweight champion, who pinned Gotch, he's essentially calling him the best pound for pound wrestler in the world.
Wow.
That's huge from a historical standpoint. The only thing is Clarence Bolden gets injured, falls off, retires, lives until the 1960s, remarries his white wife, gets declared white in all of his official government papers from then on, and so lives and dies the remainder of his life as a white man, and no one is aware of the fact that in the middle of it, well, right at the beginning of Frank Gotch's reign as a world heavyweight champion, he declared a black man to have been the best pound for pound wrestler in the world.
Wow, that's what's up. That's what's up. And
that's all stuff I had to find.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying. So as far as challenges, and that's a challenge in being thorough and really having to stay on it and say to yourself, okay, am I missing anything here? Because if I didn't go back and keep following the breadcrumbs, I could just as easily have missed that. And
definitely.
Another very quick example of this, because I know you want to ask some more questions, but another clear example of this, the first openly black world champion that I can find in North America, openly black, so not Clarence Bolden, is Ed Flowers in Boston in 1933 during his first year as a wrestler.
Name familiar. I think I heard that name.
Well, he wrestled most famously under that name as Tiger Flowers Johnstone in New York. And there was a bust done of him by a famous sculptress named Emily Winthrop Miles. That bust today sits in the Harvard Art Museums, and nobody knew who the model was who sat for it, because for the longest time they thought it was the world champion black boxer who died in 1927, Ted Tiger Flowers. Wow. So what happened was, as I'm following the breadcrumbs, I do the entire history of Rufus Jones one time through.
Okay.
And then I take a break and I'm like, let me look into this Tiger Flowers guy. I see that after he stopped wrestling in New York, he was in a few matches in the East Coast, like sporadically, and then he kind of disappears. Okay. So I go to a random posting of a Tiger Flowers show, and I'm like, why is there a promo photo of Rufus Jones in the newspaper? That's weird. So then I look up a few more, and I'm like, okay, that's another promo photo of Rufus Jones, but they're calling him Tiger Flowers. Interesting. Then I look at the match description. Yep, that's a whole lot of headbutts and a Boston Crab finish. That sounds like Rufus Jones to me. Then I go back and I look at the Rufus. I take another look at a Rufus Jones interview from Cincinnati that made zero sense to me. It was from about 1940, 1941, when he first gets to Cincinnati. And he says, well, I was the world middleweight champion in Boston, and I was taught to wrestle by a guy named Ted Germain. And after a while, I beat Ted for the world middleweight championship, and I only surrendered it because I moved up in weight to heavyweight. Well, that's completely preposterous, and it makes no sense at all. So I discarded it at the time. But then I went back and looked matches between events where Ted Germain appears with a guy named Flowers. And so in 1933, before Flowers shows up in New York in 1934 as Tiger Flowers Johnstone, he's wrestling as the Black Panther Ed Flowers in Massachusetts, and he wins the world middleweight championship, and then he loses it to Ted Germain. And so then I'm like, okay, well, what about this Tiger Flowers show in 1938 in Montreal, which looks like it was like a one-time appearance and then he disappears? Wait, there's a guy on the show named Zelis Amhara, Zelis Amhara. Well, that's kind of curious. That sounds a lot like Sealy Samara. So then I go back and I look at all of the pattern of Rufus Jones, Sealy Samara matches go on their way from Michigan into Ontario, heading toward Montreal. It's like, oh, okay. They're wrestling as Rufus Jones and Sealy Samara in Michigan and in Ontario. They pop into Montreal, where they'd wrestled in 1935 as 36 as Zelis Amhara and Tiger Flowers. They pop into where they'd broken in under those names. They use those names again in Montreal only. And then the next night, they're right back in Montreal wrestling under the names Rufus Jones and Celie Samara. So again, so I'm the person who put together the mystery after all this time that Joseph Alvin Godfrey was who was potentially the first world middleweight or world champion of Black descent openly in the U.S. in 1933. That Joseph Alvin Godfrey was both Tiger Flowers briefly, and then spent the overwhelming majority of his career wrestling as Rufus Jones, the guy who truly popularized the use of the headbutt to the extent where it became a stereotype of all Black wrestlers extending into the late 1980s.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Hey, you put a lot of work into putting this book together, man. Hey,
I tried. I tried, man.
Cool. So, were there any wrestlers or moments that surprised you during your deep dive into Black pro wrestling history?
Tons. I don't even know where to start. Like, in terms of the way the press handled Black wrestlers, it might as well have been a different planet when you start talking about the language that was being used prior to the 1960s. Like, you have the case where Frank Crozier is called the N-word in the British press. And they don't even mean it to be derogatory. They're just using it as an adjective for Black and Negro. They got sick of using those terms, so they just throw in the N-word just casually.
Wow.
And then the N-word grabbed him in a leg lock. Like, okay, that's just how they got down in that era. And then a few cases, especially in Oregon for some reason, and I don't know why, and I don't know how legitimate it is, because there were plenty of wrestler quotes that were just made up for promotional purposes. But you have several cases, primarily in Oregon, where heel wrestlers are, I mean, the writers are very freely have the N-word flowing out of the mouths of the heels, saying, like, I've already beaten that N-word before, and I don't think I should have to do it again. Wow. I mean, that was so things like that are very jarring. Like some of the descriptions, because again, there's no television. So the promoters are trying to use entertaining descriptions in order to get fans to come through the gates. And Black wrestlers were so rare in some parts of the countries. No doubt, there were likely cases extending into the 1930s in some parts of the country and in some parts of Canada, especially, where people in the general public had probably never seen a Black person in person. And so, I mean, they're advertising Blackness. There's the case I mentioned in the book where Rufus Jones is wrestling somewhere. I mean, he's medium brown. Like, he's not, if you saw him on the street, you would not say that he was particularly dark. And they're saying things like Rufus Jones is so Black that on him coal leaves a white mark. And because apparently the Blackness of the wrestler was part of the draw. It was like the circus. You want to see a really dark-skinned guy? You need to come to our show. It's finally your chance to see one in person.
Wow. And that's not to cut you off, but that's just messed up the way that that Black wrestlers were described back in the day. You know what I'm saying? And I know you telling your story, and sometimes it's just it's just like messed up that they had to go through that time. I know that back then, like women's wrestling was hard. I could just imagine, black wrestling back in the day. Just man.
Yeah. There are a lot of things occurring with black wrestling. Like, okay, descriptions in Detroit, an event that takes place at Detroit Arena Gardens, again, where all of the major wrestling events took place before Olympia was built and before Kobo was built. You've got the first mud wrestling event that ever in Detroit Arena Gardens that Rufus Jones is involved in. And the writers, the guys writing the reports, they think they're being really cute. So Rufus is wrestling his white opponent, and before long, the white opponent has mud on him, and they get really cute with the alliteration of how the fans suddenly couldn't tell the white wrestler from the black wrestler because they were both covered, they were both brown.
Yeah.
Or a black wrestler of one shade is wrestling against another black wrestler of a different shade. And oh my goodness, you better hope that they're wearing different color tights so that you can actually tell them apart. Like, okay, how about the fact that Jack Claiborne's 6'1" and very dark, and Rufus Jones is 5'7" and brown and a lot pudgier? There's it's probably not all that difficult if you just use language that's a little more descriptive.
Right, a little more appropriate too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, why do you think the contributions of black wrestlers from 1880 to 1950 have been so overlooked in mainstream wrestling history?
You're asking all the right questions. I think. So this first response may stun you, but I think to an extent, the black wrestlers of the era that followed are partially to blame.
Okay.
Because it's a lot easy it's very easy to take credit for being the first one to do something if there's no recollection of the first people to do it, and it's not recorded on film for anyone to see. We get these incredible descriptions of Jack Claiborne as being this high-flying wrestler, and it was downright upsetting, and frankly, it was nice to see the writers correct it in real time. He comes back from Hawaii in 1949. After he's just been the champion of the Hawaii territory for almost a full year, which was a landmark thing. It's far and away the longest title reign of a black wrestler in a territory ever to that date, where he's reigning as the champion. He's dominant. He's taking out all comers of all races. And they had Japanese wrestlers there at the time. They had Hawaiian wrestlers. They had some wrestlers from South America. He's beating everybody. Like Al Karasik as a promoter deserves a lot of credit. Like, he smashed Jack Claiborne over everybody in Hawaii in 1948 and 1949. Claiborne comes back to California, and usually when somebody is inbound and they just came from a territory where they were the champion, the promoters would go out of their way to say, hey, this person was very successful here and here, and they held this championship. They absolutely bury the fact that Claiborne held the championship in Hawaii for a year. They don't breathe a word of it, probably because they don't want to raise expectations that such a thing is possible or to upset anybody. Now, that isn't even the thing that upset me. The thing that upset me is when they start comparing him to major wrestling star Antonino Rocca, who's 10 years younger than Claiborne, with 15 fewer years of ring experience. And in describing Claiborne as a high flyer, they start describing him as the Black Antonino Rocca. And the analogy I used was, this would be like a boxing writer referring to Joe Louis as the Black Rocky Marciano after Lewis had had his long run, and then Marciano pops up 10 years later, and they start referring to Marciano like he was the standard bearer. Fortunately, there were some writers who realized how ridiculous this was, and at least for a brief period of time, they correct the record and essentially say, and they say that all of these moves that Rocca's doing, Claiborne was doing 10 years ago, before Rocca even knew what a wrestling ring was, in essence reframing it as Antonino Rocca is the white Jack Claiborne, which was refreshing to see and surprising for the time.
That's what's up.
I don't know if I answered your question with that one, but
yeah.
You get me on a roll, man.
Yeah, you got it. So how did segregation and racism in the early 20th century affect the careers of Black wrestlers during that era?
Oh, wait. Sorry. I did not answer your question. I didn't answer your question. So, yeah, I remember what the question was. The original question was. I'm so sorry. So,
you good.
So guys Rufus Jones dies tragically in a car accident in 1951. And by 1956, Claiborne has essentially lost all of his athleticism, and he's phased out in favor of guys like Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright. There's a famous case in Canada where Bearcat Wright is essentially brought in to replace Jack Claiborne as Luther Lindsay's tag team partner. And then Bobo Brazil effectively upstages Claiborne in Hawaii after Claiborne has lost all of his athleticism, and Bobo Brazil ends up being the guy to get the NWA title shot against Lou Thez in Hawaii when Claiborne is right there. He's been wrestling for 25 years at this point, and he's seeing the new guy who just broke into the business in 1949 getting these sorts of opportunities. So anyway, with Rufus Jones dead and Claiborne sort of forced into retirement, and Reginald Seekey dying of a heart attack in December of 1948. You get I forget his name, starts with an E, but you get Reginald Sweet Daddy Seekey starting his wrestling career at the age of like 17 or 18. So he steals the Reginald Seekey name, essentially. And even though he's much shorter and smaller, he basically takes all of Jack Claiborne's moves. Okay. And so Claiborne finds himself replaced in terms of his act. Reginald Seekey finds himself replaced in terms of his name. I think 5 or so years after Claiborne dies, you have a Black Canadian wrestler who pops up and starts going by Jack Claiborne Jr., and then starts wrestling in Japan and Australia as Jack Claiborne. You have at least 2 other Rufus Jones popping up, including Rufus R. Jones, or Rufus Freight Train Jones, who wrestles into the 1980s under that name. So, and even when Meltzer and I were talking about this book, and Meltzer wrote the foreword to Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus, The Rise of Black American Wrestling, Meltzer went out of his way to keep reminding people, this is not the Rufus Jones that the majority of you watching and listening will remember. This is the Rufus Jones that he stole his name and much of his gimmick from. So, I mean, you may steal the name it's not even homage at that point. You're just hoping that, some wrestling fans might recognize that name. and then you get them in the door, and then you continue to be the guy that gets over under that name. So no tribute. So to answer your question, no tribute was really paid to those guys from any of the people that followed that sort of preyed on that gimmick. But by the same token, in that era, people aren't thinking about being inducted into a Hall of Fame 50 years later because it doesn't exist. They're just trying to raise money to support their families by any means necessary. And if that means you have to take somebody's name to do it, then you're going to do it. So that I think is the primary reason that this wasn't preserved, because there was no tangible benefit to paying homage to the generation that preceded.
That's what's up. Now, real quick, I know you said that you have worked with Dave Meltzer, and I know a lot of people, I'm not gonna say they don't like the guy, but sometimes they get, a lot of people complain about him because of his predictions and stuff like that. What was it like for you working with Dave Meltzer?
It would be, you're being much too kind to me by characterizing it as me working with him. Dave has a massive platform. He's been much too nice to me over the years. I've sent him books. He's liked them. He's written me reviews. I asked him if he would be interested in writing the foreword to this one. He said he would love to. And before all of that, I interviewed him for a Mel magazine piece. And then I interviewed him for a follow-up piece. So he probably gave me 2 to 3 hours of his time during those interviews. I can't say enough good things about Dave Meltzer and his interest in the history. The guy is a writing machine. He pretends to be impressed when I say that I was churning out like 6,000 words a day at times in some of these writing projects. Dave does that all the time, and he's done it for more than 40 years when he's putting together Wrestling Observer newsletters. Dave's an absolute animal. He's an absolute machine. I have nothing but respect for him. And if people don't like his match reviews, well, you know what? You can review matches yourself and give them your own star ratings. And you don't have to listen to him, but he earned. I think part of the issue, and people can complain about what I'm going to say here, and that's fine. I think part of the issue is when a younger generation pops up, and like now everybody has internet access. Anybody can start a blog or start a publication. Or me, I can write a book and publish it independently. I don't have to go through any publisher to get my words out there. And so they look at somebody like Dave Meltzer and they're like, wait, why is he in the position he's in? And why do people listen to him? And they don't understand that while he was working as a high school sports writer in like the 1970s, he was doing all of this back then as a side hustle before the major Observer launch. And he had to, coming up the hard way, he had to earn access to all of the people who were acting as his sources, as his informants, to the point where he gets invited places, and a lot of the wrestling insiders respect him. And so if I was born in 1990 and I started watching wrestling in 2005, yeah, I'd probably wonder, well, wait a second, how come this guy has so much of an outsized say in what happens, and why do people care about his opinion? It's because he worked so hard to put himself into that position when it was really hard to work to get yourself into that position. And people, I think there are a lot of people who don't have an adequate level of respect, at least for how hard he had to work to put himself in the position he's in.
I can respect that, because I know that he's one of the top guys when it comes to like writing articles for wrestling and stuff. And I know he do his match ratings, and people just be in their feelings. It's just like, look, chill out. This is what the man does, and for real, like, and I'm pretty sure that they've read other articles from other wrestling writers, and you listen to the match ratings, and it's probably something that you could scratch your head on. But I know he's been in the business for a long time, and I hear a lot of people criticizing him. So I just wanted to uh,
Oh
just
yeah.
ask you what your thoughts on him were.
Yeah, well, there are people who, I mean, just as an example, like I've seen the list of Meltzer's 5-star matches. I seriously started paying attention to that in the mid 90s, and I'd say, okay, this match must be great. Let me go check it out. And I became between Meltzer and the Death Valley Driver Pro Wrestling boards. I started following those and trying to track down some of the 5-star matches. And I'd watch bouts from All Japan with Misawa against Kawada. And I'd say, okay, I see why this is a 5-star match. That might be the best match I've ever seen. And then right next to it, he'd have like When Worlds Collide, Eddie Guerrero and Love Machine Art Bar against Octagon and Hijo del Santo is a 5-star match. And I watched it, and I thought it was just okay. I didn't think it was this amazing 5-star match, but like that's fine. I got his recommendation. He loved it. I didn't, and just keep it pushing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's just so crazy, man. People just use the internet to just have Twitter fingers and just say stuff to people that just in a way to just be disrespectful. But like I said, I've seen some of his ratings, and some I agree with, some I don't. But it isn't, like you said, it's not to the point where it's just like you know what I'm saying. Some people just need to chill.
Well, once you for existence, you put yourself out here in a creative space, and the second you do that, you're gonna have 99 people who love your show and tell you your show is fantastic and that you're an excellent host and you're a great interviewer. And then you're going to get the one person in the comment section who says, this is the worst show I've ever seen. This show is garbage. I've had book reviews where people are like 5 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. Like this is really great, really vivid descriptions, some really valuable history here, fantastic. And I'm thinking of a Bugsy McGraw book in particular where someone's like, 1 star. He said on page 5 that he didn't like conscientious objectors from Vietnam, and I took the book and threw it straight in the trash. And, and okay, so you didn't read the book. It was just that one thing that triggered you, and now it's one of the worst rated things you've ever posted a review for. Like,
Right.
So yeah, you just have to have a thick skin. You have to, if you don't have a thick skin if you're a creative and you don't have a thick skin, you're going to have to develop it, because some people are just mean. And and even when you try your best, not everything you do is going to be everybody's cup of tea. So yeah, I've just developed the thing I say. If somebody criticizes me on Facebook or says this book was mid, or I didn't like it, I'll just post underneath it. I'll say, thank you for the review. I'll try harder next time, or I hope I do better next time. And that's it.
Yeah, because sometimes it's not even worth arguing with some of these people anyway, because that's how they trying to get they claim to fame anyway, just going back and forth arguing with people and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's yours that you don't really own is your reputation. It's like the aggregate and the average of other people's opinions of you, and you don't own it. You don't even have the right to it. Like, you can try to manipulate it by doing different things, but you don't own it. And you can, and you can't obsess over controlling it. You just have to do the best you can and understand that not everybody is going to like everything you do, and that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that I'm learning, doing this podcast and just putting out content, the draw people in and stuff. Everybody ain't gonna like what you do, but for the people that do like what you do, just keep doing what you're doing, but you still gotta do things to make your show better, make your content better. But for the most part, since I've been doing this, it's been all love, and I've been enjoying the ride.
Yeah, just keep doing it, and your audience, the audience that's meant to find you, will find you if you stay true to your format.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, what do you hope readers and wrestling fans take away from A Decided Novelty, and where do you see the future of Black wrestling history going from here?
Well, we talked before the show. I mentioned the BET Best Pro Wrestlers of All Time list, and I had a conversation with Mark Henry after that. And Mark contributed the foreword to John Cosper's book from a few years back about the Black Panther Jim Mitchell. Mark is a big fan of Black pro wrestling history, and all he said to me when he looked at that list, he said, "I disagree. A lot of names were left off." And he's right. You had about 90 years, give or take, of names that were left off that list. And from 1880 to 1950, for the most part, most people don't even know the names. So for those people who are interested in learning about the subject matter so that they have a fully informed opinion, I hope they find their way to this book. I know the WWE has some difficulty identifying suitable Black candidates for induction every single year. And so that they don't have to figure out creative ways to induct Booker T 5 times or Ron Simmons 4 times.
Right.
Or, well, we got to buy TNA just so we can figure out how to induct Devon as a member of Aces and Eights at some point, just to get another Black guy in there. You can induct the original Rufus Jones. You could induct him twice. You can induct him as Tiger Flowers too if you wanted to. You can induct Jim Mitchell, Celie Samara, Clarence Bolden, Vero Small. There are probably 20 names, 15 to 20 names in this book that are worthy of induction into almost every Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that I think I had this discussion with Meltzer. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is people, myself included, I'm not just pointing fingers outward, I'm pointing them at myself too. When you don't know about something, especially in wrestling, and you're trying to figure out who was good, there's a tendency to just, okay, let me look up the Wikipedia entry. Okay, they held this championship, this championship, this championship, this championship. They wrestled in these places, and they wrestled for 20 years. Okay, maybe they deserve a Hall of Fame induction. And you can't do that with the Black pro wrestlers prior to 1950 because the top guys were given plenty of main event title shots almost everywhere they went. But because the wrestling promoters were concerned about consistently drawing the dollars of a primarily white wrestling audience, you risked a lot if you gave the championship to a Black wrestler and they didn't draw. It was probably assumed that they wouldn't. And therefore, you have guys like Claiborne who have an absurdly low title count, but he was probably between himself and Joe Godfrey, the original Rufus Jones, they were probably the most influential wrestlers in terms of shaping what became an identifiable Black pro wrestling style that persisted into the early 1990s. And most people don't even know their names. So to summarize, I'm hoping people discover these guys, and once they do, I'm hoping that they're willing to give them the veneration that they deserve.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's a lot of names in this book. A lot of history in here, and I'm definitely gonna keep reading it. And anybody that is watching this podcast, A Decided Novelty, check it out. It's on Amazon, right?
Absolutely.
It's on Amazon. Make sure you look it up. Get you a copy. Read this book. A lot of history in this book that a lot of people don't know about. So since we've been talking about all this history, this Black pro wrestling history from the past, and I know you said before we went live that you haven't really watched wrestling in the past 5 years because you've been doing the book and stuff. But just on the last time you watched, what do you think about the current state of Black pro wrestling?
Well, from the last time that I seriously watched, probably 2020. But from what I've been hearing, there's just far more opportunity these days than there used to be. And I mean, again, I interviewed Tony Khan and a lot of people for The Ringer. Great profile piece. We got into, he was very open about his love for e-wrestling from back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Ahmed Johnson for the Hall of Fame. That's hilarious. But Tony Khan was very open about his fondness for e-wrestling back in the day, and that's how he got started writing wrestling shows in the first place. His e-wrestling show back in the day was called Dynamite, and he revealed to me that he views the present Dynamite as a continuation of his e-wrestling show that he started writing years before the Khan family owned a wrestling promotion and founded AEW, which blew my mind. But I think guys like Tony Khan, who are Tony's our age, that he's fully aware that there was this stigma that if you looked a certain way, you might not appeal to the audience in the way a promoter would have preferred, and so you didn't get certain opportunities. And I think I think guys like him are all about, okay, who's the most entertaining, who's the most charismatic, who has the best moves, who's getting over with the audience, and if you check all the boxes, we'll give you the opportunity. And I think there's way more of that in the modern era, and frankly, there's an acceptance of it that should have been present 100 years ago when sports writers and editorials were saying, it's really bizarre that there are so many world champions in boxing. They're writing this in the 1920s. There are so many world champions in boxing. So many talented Black fighters have come through the ranks and captured captured a world championship in almost every boxing weight class. Why is it that we don't get any Black wrestlers at all for the most part? And those that show up, how come they can't win any championships? Well, that should have been their first clue that what they were watching wasn't authentic combat. And so it's pro wrestling is starting to catch up from that standpoint of presentation and accomplishments of Black athletes. They're catching up to where boxing was 100 years ago.
Yeah. I would say the current state of pro wrestling, Black pro wrestling, is incredible. I would say we've made a lot of history. with Kofi Kingston winning the title a few years back. Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair, the first two black women to main event WrestleMania, which is one of my favorite WrestleMania matches and slash moments. Even Kofi, when he won the title, that's one of my favorite moments. I think black women in pro wrestling, women's wrestling is on the rise, and I think women's wrestling right now is better than men's pro wrestling. And just even right now with WWE, Naomi just won the women's world title. She cashed in Money in the Bank. You got women in NXT that are doing their thing. And what I would like to see more of, I would like to see more black men in the main event, especially in WWE. They have good black wrestlers. You got Trick Williams, you got Carmelo Hayes. The guy that I think is going to be, as far as black wrestlers, I think who's going to be that guy, Obafemi from NXT. If you haven't checked him out, check him out. I think when he finally gets that call up, I think he might be the next black world champion. He's that good. He's got the look. He's got the character. I would like to see the men get pushed more. But as far as on the women's side, they're doing their thing. Bianca Belair, Jade Cargill, Naomi. I'm trying to think of some Sasha Banks with Mercedes Moné over at AEW. She became the highest paid woman in professional wrestling over in AEW. She's holding all the belts from all the promotions and everything. So, and then even with Swerve Strickland, he was the first black AEW world champion. You know what I'm saying? Scorpio Sky was the first black champion in AEW, period. So
yeah, that's a tag champ, right?
Tag champ. Yeah. So I think we're on the rise, and I think even in the independents, black wrestling has been good, and I think it's just gonna keep evolving. That's my opinion.
Well, I mean, hopefully it reaches the point where, I hate to say it this way, but hopefully it reaches the point where when it happens, we don't notice it, and it's not even worth calling out because it's so commonplace.
Yeah,
that's my hope, that it becomes something that isn't that atypical, that it's special.
Definitely. Well, Ian, I thank you for coming on. You dropped a lot of knowledge, dropped a lot of history here on today's show. Real quick, want to give a shout out to CJ Meisner and Rick Del Santo. They left comments on the show. Of course, Crander Q, host of Friends of the Square Circle, he left a comment. Thank you for everybody that's been watching and leaving likes and stuff. Before we get out of here, where can the people find you, and do you want to give any plugs and shout outs?
Oh boy. Shout outs, fresh in my mind. Shout out to Briscoe and Bradshaw. I spoke to them earlier today. So that's fresh in my mind. They invited me to come to the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame event next year. So I'll have to negotiate my wife to see if she'll let me make that trip. Shout out to Oliver Lee Bateman, the best writer in the world, pro wrestling or otherwise. And my writing partner over at The Ringer for several years now. Shout out to John Cosper, Kenny Casanova, Keith Elliott Greenberg, Scott Teal, Greg Oliver. A somber shout out to my friend Jamie Lee Hemmings, who was every pro wrestling writer's favorite person, who passed away suddenly and tragically earlier this year, in February. Yeah, she wrote for Slam Wrestling for several years, and everybody absolutely adored her. Shout out to everybody who is willing to sit through this interview, because I know that wrestling history isn't necessarily everybody's favorite topic, but I really appreciate everybody who tuned in. Thank you to Crander Q for connecting us, and shout out to you for having me on the platform. I've
Oh, no
never
problem.
I've never been on a Michigan-based pro wrestling podcast, so it's nice to be on a podcast that's appealing to my hometown area.
Definitely, and same here. You know, I love having guests from the home state or the city. You know, just having that connection, and you know, not saying that a lot of people from Detroit are not wrestling fans, but you know, growing up and you know, being in the inner city, sometimes they can be like, "Man, why you watching that?" and this and that. But hey, wrestling is wrestling. I enjoy it. You enjoy it. You know, once again, thank you for coming on. And before I get out of here, let me give my shout outs. I just want to give shout out to everybody in the whole IWC, whether you're a content creator, podcaster, wrestling promoter, referee, whatever. Just shout out to everybody. Everybody keep doing your thing, keep grinding. Shout out to Ian. Make sure you get this book, The Decided Novelty.
And shout out to the city of Southfield because we don't get enough respect.
Shout out to the city of Southfield too. Make sure you check Wrestling from the 313 on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. Sometimes I'm on Twitter, but if you see Wrestling from the 313, go ahead and leave us a like or a follow. And like I always like to end my show, support wrestling podcasters, support independent wrestling, and once again, support Ian and get A Decided Novelty, an essential guide to Black pro wrestling history, 1880 to 1950. So, once again, for Ian Douglas, I am Mike D, host of Wrestling from the 313. I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Until then, I will holler at you later. Peace.